Good evening, I'm David Whitmore, and tonight we're looking beyond the headlines to understand what may become one of the most politically significant presidential speeches of the year. President Donald Trump addressed the nation in prime time with a message centered on election integrity, national security, and what he described as a need to restore public confidence in America's voting system. Supporters called it a necessary warning. Critics called it a dangerous return to claims that have already been examined for years. But neither reaction tells the full story, because regardless of where you stand politically, this speech wasn't simply about the 2020 election. It wasn't only about voting machines, and it wasn't just another campaign speech delivered from the White House. It revealed something much larger, a battle over who defines reality in American politics. Within hours of the address, major television networks, political leaders, election officials, and legal experts were responding. Some broadcasters chose not to carry the speech live, citing concerns about repeating claims that have previously been rejected by courts, audits, and bipartisan election officials. Others argued that a sitting president should always be heard directly by the American people. That immediate divide tells us something important. This wasn't merely a speech, it was a test of institutions, a test of public trust, and perhaps most importantly, a test of how Americans now consume political information. Tonight, we're going to separate the verified facts from the political narratives. We'll examine what President Trump actually said. We'll compare those statements with publicly available evidence. We'll analyze why this speech arrived at this particular moment. And we'll explore why the reaction may ultimately matter more than the speech itself. Because history often remembers not only what leaders say, but how a nation responds. Let's begin. When major political speeches are delivered from the White House, they rarely exist in a vacuum. Every sentence, every pause, every phrase is carefully chosen, not just for the people watching at home, but for lawmakers, foreign governments, financial markets, and political allies. And that's what makes this address worth examining. Because whether you agreed with President Trump or strongly disagreed, the speech was designed to accomplish something. The real question is, what? To answer that, we have to look beyond the headlines. The central message of the address was straightforward. President Trump argued that confidence in America's electoral system has been damaged and that significant reforms are needed before future elections can restore public trust. Those arguments are familiar. They've been part of American political debate for years. But the timing of this speech is what caught so many analysts' attention. It came at a moment when the country is already deeply polarized, Congress remains sharply divided, multiple legal battles continue across the country, and the next election cycle is rapidly approaching. In politics, timing is rarely accidental. Sometimes a speech is intended to persuade, sometimes it's meant to reassure supporters, and sometimes it's meant to reshape the conversation itself. That may be the most important takeaway from this address, because within minutes of the broadcast ending, the national conversation had shifted. Instead of discussing economic reports, or foreign policy, or congressional negotiations, media coverage became almost entirely focused on one topic, the speech. Supporters described it as a necessary warning. Opponents argued that many of the election-related claims repeated long-standing allegations that have been rejected by numerous court rulings, state election officials, and post-election reviews. Those competing reactions were entirely predictable. But something else happened. Television networks found themselves facing a difficult editorial decision. Should every statement made during a presidential address be broadcast in full, or should networks interrupt to provide immediate fact-checking and context? That question has become increasingly complicated in modern journalism. Decades ago, most Americans received their news from just a handful of television networks. Today, information moves differently. A speech is no longer simply watched. It's clipped, shared, edited, debated, and within seconds, millions of people are often watching entirely different versions of the same event. Some viewers only see the opening minute. Others only see the most controversial soundbite. Still others never watch the speech at all. They experience it through reactions posted on social media. That changes everything. Because political communication is no longer just about what is said. It's about which moments survive the news cycle and which moments disappear. That's why speeches today are often designed with short, shareable clips in mind, not just complete arguments. Individual moments, moments that supporters celebrate, moments that opponents criticize. In today's media environment, attention has become one of the most valuable political resources in the world. And whether intentional or not, President Trump's address succeeded in capturing it. The question we're left with is a much bigger one. Did the speech actually change anyone's mind, or did it simply reinforce opinions that already existed? Because those are two very different outcomes. And understanding that difference may tell us far more about American politics than the speech itself. Let's pause for a moment. Politics isn't only about policy, it's about perception. Throughout history, successful political leaders have understood one simple principle. If you can shape the conversation, you can shape the political battlefield. That doesn't mean you control what people believe. It means you influence what people are talking about. And that's an important distinction. Whether you're looking at Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, or Donald Trump, every modern president has tried in different ways to define the national conversation before someone else does. President Trump has arguably taken that strategy further than anyone in recent American history. For years, his political style has relied on dominating the news cycle. Supporters see this as strength. Critics see it as distraction. But regardless of opinion, the strategy has repeatedly proven effective at commanding attention. Think about what happened after this address. News organizations immediately shifted resources. Political commentators interrupted their scheduled programming. Members of Congress began issuing statements. Governors responded. Legal experts weighed in. Within hours, the speech had become the biggest political story in America. Now here's the interesting question. Was that always the objective? Because sometimes winning the argument isn't the immediate goal. Winning the attention battle is. Attention drives headlines. Headlines drive public discussion. And public discussion often influences political momentum. That's why communication experts frequently distinguish between persuasion and agenda setting. Persuasion changes minds. Agenda setting changes conversations. Those are not the same thing, and history suggests that changing the conversation can sometimes be just as powerful. Consider how quickly major political stories can disappear. Economic reports, international conflicts, congressional negotiations, even major legislation. They can all vanish from the front page within hours if another story captures the nation's attention. In today's digital world, the competition isn't simply between political parties, it's between narratives. Every headline competes against thousands of others. Every speech competes for limited public attention. And every politician understands that visibility itself has become a form of political power. That's why presidential speeches are no longer judged only by their content. They're judged by what happens afterward. Did they move financial markets? Did they influence lawmakers? Did they dominate social media? Did they energize supporters? Did they force opponents to respond? In many ways, the reaction becomes part of the speech itself. That's exactly what happened here. Almost immediately, political organizations began fundraising around the address. Campaign emails were sent within minutes. Supporters highlighted key excerpts. Opponents published rapid response fact checks. Cable news devoted hours of continuous coverage. The speech had ended, but the political event had only just begun. And that's something many viewers overlook. Modern political communication doesn't stop when the cameras turn off. That's when its second phase begins. The online debate, the interviews, the editorials, the polling, the fundraising, the campaign messaging, the legal analysis, all of it becomes part of a much larger political ecosystem, which raises another important question. If every major speech immediately becomes a political weapon, can Americans still evaluate presidential addresses on their own merits? Or has every national address become just another battle in an endless information war? Because that question may ultimately matter far more than any single speech ever could. Here's where the story becomes even more interesting, because history tells us that presidential speeches rarely change the country overnight, but they often reveal where the country already is. Think back to some of the most memorable presidential addresses in modern history. John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Ronald Reagan after the Challenger disaster, George W. Bush in the days following September 11th, Barack Obama after the death of Osama bin Laden. Each speech reflected a different America, different challenges, different fears, different priorities, but they all shared one common objective: to unite public opinion around a particular understanding of events. Today's political environment is very different. America no longer consumes information through a single national lens. Instead, millions of Americans are watching completely different realities unfold. Some rely on traditional television networks. Others receive nearly all of their information through social media. Some trust independent journalists. Others trust government officials. And increasingly, many trust only the voices they already agree with. That changes the role of a presidential address. A speech is no longer the beginning of a national conversation. It's often the beginning of thousands of separate conversations happening simultaneously. Each audience hears something different. Supporters hear determination, critics hear controversy, undecided voters often hear confusion. The same speech, three entirely different interpretations. That's why political analysts spend so much time studying public reaction instead of simply analyzing the speech itself. Because the speech ends, the interpretation continues for days, sometimes weeks, and occasionally for years. This address followed that exact pattern. Within hours, political organizations from both parties had released statements framing the speech in completely different ways. One side described it as a defense of democratic accountability. The other argued that it repeated claims that have been extensively investigated and rejected by numerous courts and election officials. Neither side was speaking only to the American public. They were speaking to their own supporters, reinforcing existing beliefs, strengthening existing narratives. That's one of the defining characteristics of modern politics. Convincing your opponents has become increasingly difficult. Motivating your own supporters has become increasingly important. Campaign strategists understand this better than anyone. They know elections are often decided not by changing millions of minds, but by encouraging millions of supporters to actually vote. That distinction matters. Because when analysts ask whether a speech was successful, they're often asking the wrong question. Success isn't always measured by approval ratings. Sometimes it's measured by enthusiasm, volunteer signups, campaign donations, media attention, online engagement, and voter turnout months later. Those effects are much harder to measure in real time, which is why immediate headlines can sometimes be misleading. A speech declared a failure on Tuesday may end up helping a campaign 6 months later. Likewise, a speech praised as a political triumph may quickly fade from public memory. History is full of examples. Political momentum is rarely determined by one event. It's built over hundreds of moments, large and small, expected and unexpected. And that's why experienced political observers are often cautious about declaring instant winners and losers. Because politics has a remarkable way of surprising everyone. The loudest reaction isn't always the most important one. Sometimes, the most significant political shifts happen quietly in polling data, in fundraising reports, in voter registration numbers, or in suburban counties that receive almost no national media attention. Those are often the places where elections are truly decided. To understand tonight, it helps to look backward, because this isn't the first time American leaders have questioned the machinery of democracy itself. After the 2000 election, the country waited more than a month to learn who had won the presidency. Recounts, lawsuits, a divided Supreme Court decision. Millions of Americans on both sides walked away from that year believing something had gone wrong, even though they disagreed on what. That episode didn't destroy American democracy, but it did leave a mark. It planted a question that has never fully gone away. Can the system be trusted to get it right every single time? Every election cycle since has carried some version of that question, sometimes louder, sometimes quieter, but rarely absent entirely. What makes the current moment different isn't the existence of doubt. Doubt about elections is not new in America. What's different is the speed and the scale at which that doubt can now spread. In past decades, a controversial claim about an election might take days or weeks to circulate widely, debated mostly in newspapers, town halls, and congressional hearings. Today, a single sentence from a presidential address can reach tens of millions of people in minutes, stripped of context, repeated, reshaped, and reinterpreted by algorithms designed to maximize engagement, not accuracy. That's not a partisan observation. It's a structural one. It applies to leaders and claims across the political spectrum. Historians who study political rhetoric often point out that trust in institutions rarely collapses because of one moment. It erodes gradually, through repetition, through years of competing narratives, through each side becoming more certain the other is arguing in bad faith, which is why some analysts argue this speech should be understood less as an isolated event, and more as one more data point in a much longer story about how Americans relate to their own democratic institutions. A story that began long before this administration, and one that will almost certainly continue long after it. So where does this go from here? If history is any guide, the next few weeks will matter more than the speech itself. Here's what experienced political observers say they'll be watching. First, legal and legislative response. Will any of the claims made in the address lead to new legislation, new investigations, or new court challenges? Or will the speech remain, as many presidential addresses do, primarily a political statement rather than a policy one? Second, how state election officials respond. Many of the officials responsible for actually running American elections are neither strongly aligned with one party nor the other. Their public statements, procedural changes, or lack thereof often say more about the real state of election administration than any speech from Washington. Third, polling movement, not headlines. Cable news reaction is immediate and loud. Polling movement is slow and quiet. Analysts typically wait 2 to 3 weeks before drawing any conclusions about whether a speech shifted public opinion at all, because early reactions are dominated by people who already had strong opinions to begin with. Fourth, fundraising and mobilization numbers. As mentioned earlier, campaigns often measure success not in persuasion, but in motivation. Watch whether fundraising totals, volunteer signups, or rally attendance shift in the weeks following the address. And fifth, whether the story has staying power at all. In the modern news cycle, even the most explosive political moments frequently get replaced within days by the next controversy, the next crisis, or the next headline. Whether this speech is still being discussed a month from now may ultimately say more about its true impact than anything said on the night it was delivered. None of these are dramatic developments. None of them will trend on social media the way the speech itself did, but collectively, they tend to tell the real story, the one that unfolds quietly, long after the cameras have moved on. There's one more piece of this story worth examining before we close. And it has nothing to do with President Trump specifically. It has to do with all of us. Because underneath every debate about this speech lies a much older, much harder question. In a democracy, who gets to decide what counts as fact? For most of the 20th century, that answer was relatively simple, even if imperfect. A small number of television networks, wire services, and major newspapers acted as gatekeepers. They decided what was newsworthy. They decided how claims were checked. And for better or worse, most Americans absorbed a broadly similar version of events. That system had real flaws, it sometimes missed stories, it sometimes reflected the blind spots of the people running it. But it also created something increasingly rare today, a shared starting point. That shared starting point has largely disappeared. Now, fact-checking itself has become part of the political battle. Organizations that verify claims are often accused of bias by whichever side feels targeted. Even the term fact-check has become, for some voters, a signal of political allegiance rather than a neutral process. That's an extraordinary shift. It means two Americans can watch the exact same speech, read two different sets of fact checks, and walk away with completely opposite understandings of what just happened. Each one convinced they have the objective truth. Media researchers have a name for part of this phenomenon: motivated reasoning. It's the tendency of people to more easily accept information that confirms what they already believe and to scrutinize or simply dismiss information that challenges it. It's not unique to any political party. It's not unique to this moment in history. It's a basic feature of how human beings process information under pressure, uncertainty, and tribal loyalty. But it becomes especially powerful in an environment engineered, often by algorithms, to keep people engaged rather than informed. Social media platforms are not designed around a mission to help people understand the world more accurately. They're designed to maximize the amount of time people spend scrolling, watching, and reacting. And unfortunately, outrage, fear, and certainty tend to hold attention far more effectively than nuance, complexity, or careful qualification ever will. That creates a difficult incentive structure for anyone trying to report on a story like tonight's. The most measured, careful analysis often earns far less attention than the loudest, most emotionally charged reaction. Which means the version of this story that reaches the most people isn't necessarily the most accurate one. It's the version most engineered to be shared. That's not a reason for cynicism, it's a reason for vigilance. Because the antidote isn't simply picking a side and trusting it completely. It's asking better questions. Where did this claim originate? Has it been independently verified? Who benefits from me believing it? And am I evaluating this evidence the same way I would if it came from the other side of the political spectrum? Those questions won't resolve every disagreement about tonight's speech, but they're a far better starting point than simply accepting whichever version confirms what we already believed walking in. And in an era where information itself has become contested terrain, that kind of discipline may be one of the most valuable things any citizen can practice. So where does all of this leave us? If there's one lesson to take away from this story, it's this: presidential speeches are rarely just about the words being spoken. They're about timing, they're about strategy, and perhaps more than anything else, they're about influence. President Trump's national address immediately became one of the most talked about political events in the country, not simply because of what was said, but because of the reactions it triggered. Supporters saw conviction, critics saw controversy, media organizations debated how the speech should be covered, political leaders rushed to respond, and millions of Americans interpreted the very same address through completely different lenses. That alone tells us something profound about the current state of American politics. The country isn't just divided by ideology, it's increasingly divided by information. People aren't only debating different opinions, they're often working from entirely different versions of reality. And that may be one of the greatest challenges facing modern democracy, because trust, once it's lost, is incredibly difficult to rebuild, whether it's trust in elections, trust in institutions, trust in government, or trust in the media itself. Every national debate ultimately comes back to one question: who do Americans believe? That's a question no president can answer alone, no political party can answer alone, and certainly no single speech can answer alone. It will ultimately be decided by evidence, transparency, accountability, and the willingness of citizens to examine facts, even when those facts challenge their own assumptions. That's why it's so important to separate emotion from evidence, to distinguish verified information from political messaging, and to remember that in a healthy democracy, questioning claims is not a weakness, it's a responsibility. The months ahead will almost certainly bring more speeches, more investigations, more campaign rallies, more headlines, and undoubtedly more political drama. But as always, the biggest story isn't necessarily the loudest one. Sometimes the most important developments happen quietly. In courtrooms, in state legislatures, inside election offices, in economic reports, and ultimately at the ballot box. Those are the places where history is written, not on social media, not in television studios, and not in a single evening address. We'll continue following the facts as they develop, separating verified reporting from speculation, and providing the broader context behind the headlines, because understanding what's happening is far more valuable than simply reacting to it. I'm David Whitmore. Thank you for watching Breaking News Analysis. If you found this analysis valuable, consider subscribing and joining us for future in-depth reports on the stories shaping America and the world. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and never stop asking the questions that matter.